Good morning to all of you. I'm going to begin by making excuses for my lack of preparation today. I was figuring this morning that I had about 12 hours of awake time in Midlothian from the end of church last week to the beginning of church today. I was busy doing work at our district level and at our synod level, but I do want you to know that I wasn't entirely neglecting my work at Living Hope. I listened to a book about apologetics while I was in the car and on the plane. It's one I've heard references made to a number of times in other literature that I've read, and the title is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God? A lot of the charges from secularists and the new atheists is that Christians are horrible people because they worship a horrible God. And they'll point to things that God did, especially in the Old Testament, that they would call murder and genocide and the abuse of women and stuff like that. So this book addresses those things. I have to say I really wasn't all that impressed with it. It's probably not one that I would recommend. And my even though I think it had valuable things in it, but in general it seemed to try to play down what God did and say, well, God wasn't really all that bad. Was sort of a theme that it kept coming back to. Instead of being upfront about God's justice against sin. So I'm sure that there's things from the book that will be valuable to me and to us as we get into topics like that, but maybe not one that I'm ready to suggest to you. Thankfully, there's some pastors in the Wisconsin Synod that are starting something called the Institute for Lutheran Apologetics that will address these things on a solid Lutheran foundation. That work is just getting started now, and where they are going to focus their work at first is developing curricula for grade schools, high schools, and the college level, so in schools of our church body, to prepare students especially for objections that they're going to face when they get into those who go to public colleges or any kind of university setting. Chances are that you're going to run into people who don't have much regard for Christianity and will try to talk you out of it. So the purpose of that is primarily to develop those kind of curricula, but also secondarily to prepare material for wider consumption. I'm sure a lot of those things that they develop will serve a double purpose. So that'll be nice. That will really increase our library of resources. So last time we addressed the objection that the Bible is unreliable. I would like to do a little bit of practice today with what we learned last time. So somebody asks you the question. I think an excellent place to start is to see what exactly they're talking about. Maybe draw out prejudices that they have and things that they just haven't thought through before. Maybe they're just parroting things that they've heard from other people. So for a lot of things, what makes you say that is just a great way to continue the conversation. Instead of going on the defense or offense right away. So these are the five that I set out to address in this chapter of our study. So what makes you say that? Someone might say, well, the Bible's been translated so many times we can't trust the meaning. It's been copied so many times we don't know what the original said, and it has mistakes and self-contradictions. The first and the third were the topic of our conversation last time, and we also started on the transmission of the New Testament manuscripts, and it's being copied. We watched the video of that distinguished professor at UNC Chapel Hill telling the audience how he how he mocks his students and enlightens his students to know that you really can't trust the Bible. And that's where we ended last time. The practice that I'd like to do with you is to take these two that we covered more thoroughly. We're going to spend some more time in this one today. But to imagine this conversation. Okay, your friend asks you, do you really believe everything in the Bible? And you say, I'm going to take for granted what you're going to say. Yes. Okay. Your friend says, but haven't they proven a lot of it to be false? Notice, I don't have the friend being really adversarial about this, because I think that more often it's going to be like this, like more of a friendly conversation than one full of enmity. Okay? Okay? What do you mean? Maybe they won't have anything to say. Maybe they will.
They who?
Yeah? Who's they? Yeah. Yeah. Let's branch off now from these two. So what do you mean? So they say on the one hand, it's been translated so many times we can't trust the meaning. On the other hand, well, it has mistakes and contradicts itself. Can we take like 90 seconds and you can think to yourself or work with a partner on this side. We'll do, it's been translated so many times you can't trust the meaning. And on this side, feel free to talk amongst each other. It has mistakes and self-contradictions. And just think of like a rough draft of points that you might make in addressing those objections. So I'll give you 90 minutes of quiet time to think and talk about those.
90 minutes.
Did I say? So after church, you stay after. Don't think about the bottom one at all, since we really haven't gotten to dive into that one yet. Let's start with, it's been translated so many times we can't trust the meaning. Volunteer from this side that would like to give any points on that, on how you might address it?
It's been translated from the original manuscript, not from the translations that keep coming down.
Okay. To rephrase what Joan said, it's when it's translated, it's not a translation of a translation, but virtually all translations are based on the original languages. So the intervening translations, say all the English translations or whichever were made before the New International Version, they weren't the basis of the NIV, but the same Hebrew and Greek. And in fact, well, anything else? David?
I would say that before we go down the road that John said, again, it's draw them out. What makes you say this? Let them give you something to work with. Otherwise, it's going to result in an argument of opinion. Draw them out. Let them define what is it you have a problem with. Do they even know that?
A good place to start out is have you read the Bible? Yeah. And ask for specifics?
Yeah.
Is there anything in general, or is it just that somebody has told you not to trust any of it? There might be a few steps in between that and the explanation that it's translated from the original. Anything else? I could hold my tongue. Ralph?
I'm thinking of the new translation our sisters did. And one thing when we talk to people that gives us comfort, we could be reassured that the Bible is correct, because people like yourself have been trained in the original languages, and you study from the original languages even today.
So you could say something like, yeah, we do take seriously that we have the meaning of the original, and we train our pastors that they are able to read it from the original, so that we're not dependent upon a translation, even though translations are generally very reliable. Yeah, Ralph?
Am I correct in my assumption? I shouldn't assume anything really, but my observation has been that even the newer pastors coming out, or vicars and stuff like that, people are being trained now. When they get into the field, they are doing their preparation for their sermons and their lessons. Still they refer back to the original languages. They just don't refer to for example, the Synod Bible.
Yes, I can't speak for everyone, but that should be the common practice.
That's-
And the training is certainly there for it.
Over the years, that's been my observation, is that even when we had vacancy and we had vicars, that they were going back into the original languages for that week's lesson.
Yes, yeah. I certainly hope that that's being done consistently. Yeah, Sue?
We visited a church somewhere once that did a very interesting Bible class, because everybody in the class had different versions of the Bible, different translations. And the pastor stood up in front and read from the original language and asked discussion to compare the different versions of the Bible people had in the audience. That was enlightening.
Yeah. I think in that shelf we have 4 different translations. Another thing that you might add is when you look at the embarrassment of English translations that are available to us, compare them. Like, do you see big differences? Even with different goals of translations as far as what kind of reading level they're aiming for, things like that, you're gonna find consistency because even though no translation carries everything over from one language to another, they carry a lot. So look at all the different translations. They say the same thing. We will look at a couple exceptions to that today, so those are going to be aware of. One more thing I would add, if there's something else, that all the multitude of translations that we have, that's just kind of like lots and lots of practice. Like, we can learn from all those things, and over the years, scholarship has certainly reached new levels. Found more manuscripts on which to base the translations, have a firmer idea of what the original said. So having a whole lot of translations doesn't hurt the cause, it only helps it. The only thing it really hurts is that it makes it more complicated to pick one because there's so many. Okay, good. How about it has mistakes and self-contradictions? Maybe looking primarily at this side, but that doesn't mean that you guys can't say anything. Joan?
I think we were talking about like the same thing that Dave said. It'd be good to ask them to give you some examples.
Yeah.
And Claire was talking about her own friends who might say something like that they probably have never read the Bible, so they're not going to give you a lot of examples, but that might be a good time to encourage them to read some of it too.
Excellent. Here to ask for some precision and examples would be very helpful. And maybe you'll know, maybe you'll know how to answer, maybe you won't, but you certainly can, in any case, say, well, let me go back and let me go look at that a little bit more. That humility and saying, give me some time. I think that goes a long way in engendering trust. Sarah?
So I think what we talked about last time too, if you have studied it further, just kind of the guy that went up and said there's all these 30,000 whatever differences that you could just memorize or have a couple of the arguments that people make and just say, well, they might be referring to this, and how you have the one phrase that means the same thing, it's just said about 10 different ways. You can just have that kind of to point it out and say, oh, do you mean something like this? Well, let's look more closely at it and is it really saying anything different? And that just could be something we could be chartered with.
Yeah, having some examples at the ready, definitely so. Morris?
The fact that a lot of times when people think that it's contradicting itself, it's because they haven't read carefully, taking things out of context. Because more often than not, the Bible supports itself, and instead of contradicting, it supports things as you go through that they're talking about the same thing.
Yes, most often those apparent contradictions are not the fault of the Bible, but they are the fault of the reader not paying attention. Per the example last time of Genesis chapter 2, saying that when God created Adam, there were no plants or shrubs of the field yet, which might lead a person to jump to the conclusion, well, there was no vegetation yet, but it doesn't say that. And in fact, that it's saying no shrub or plant of the field is there, that's setting us up for something that's coming when God says to Adam, by the sweat of your brow you'll eat your food. You will eat the plants of the field. That there was a change that took place after the fall of sin. I think I cut somebody off with sorry.
I was just going to say, I experienced an example of that. When we first moved to Tennessee, I started having the women in the neighborhood come over for a Friday night session where we did scrapbooking or crafts or whatever. And one of the women was always proselytizing, and she told everybody that the Bible was wrong because, or that everybody thinks there was a flood, but there wasn't one world flood, there were two floods. And I asked her what made her think there were two floods. And she said, well, there was one flood where they took the animals 2 by 2, and there was another flood where there were 7 of everything. And I went and got my Bible, and I pulled it open to the flood story, and I said, okay, show me where the difference is. And of course, it's one right after the other. I just asked her a series of questions about what practices were, what she knew about the Bible up to that point, and led her to the fact that it was one section giving more detail about the flood than the other section. And she was embarrassed. It didn't end well. She slammed my Bible shut and said, well, you just used the wrong Bible.
Yeah, we can't control how people are going to react. Anything else? So let's move on to this one, which we dipped our toes in the water last time by watching that video, which I timed very poorly, that we listened to this guy say all this deceptive stuff. I'm like, oh, on time, don't have time to address it. So
That gave us time to fume.
I was certainly fume when I watch it. Can we recall some things some points that this professor made? So his name to review is Bart Ehrman. He is a giant in the academic field of textual criticism. He studied directly in his doctoral and postdoctoral work under the premier textual critic of the 20th century. He's very well credentialed. He's written academic articles. He's written popular books. So somebody who's got, trust me, kind of written all over him, but he uses that to promote his agenda in convincing people that you can't trust the Bible. Can we recall some of the things that he said that would lead a person to the conclusion that the Bible is unreliable? Is any general point that he made or how he made it?
The copies have been copied, and they've been copied, and they've been copied over and
Okay.
over. So
This guy, who probably didn't know the language very well, made a copy, and we don't know anything about how he made the copy, and then other people copied that, and other people copied that, and, well, Sarah, I don't want to steal anyone else's
I can't
thunder.
remember the number, but that there's over 30,000 differences that they found in the different transcripts or whatever. I can't remember the number, but
Sure.
he alleged some really huge number without
And-
giving any context of what those differences are.
In 1707, there was a man who wanted to make a copy of the Greek New Testament, and so starting from scratch, he had all these manuscripts to work with, and he had to decide, well, which version am I going to place in this Bible? So he compares the manuscripts, and there's so many in there that he identifies in that printed work 30,000 places where there are differences. He goes on to say that there are so many differences that finally, when you try to include them all, that nobody knows how many there are. 100,000, 300,000 mistakes, as he says it, and there's more errors in the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament. Those were his closing statements. Everything he says, he uses selective facts He doesn't tell us everything, but selectively uses facts that are in and of themselves true. And then I would put it this way, that just like in politics, you have one story and you have 10 different spins on it, and he spins it exactly the way that he wants to spin it. And his attitude when he speaks, he's not speaking to his students right now, but talking to people that are probably paying whatever to listen to him speak, about how he educates his students and how his students really don't know much coming in. In fact, most of them have never even read the Bible, which is sad, but that's probably true too. So I fumed for a while after we finished watching it. Here is what I believe the impression would be if we just rewatched what we watched last time, of how the New Testament came to be. So, say this were the original, say the Apostle John wrote. Maybe John wrote something, an angel looked at Ephesus, so fair were her sons, whoever saw them would give up his life. Somebody copies it. God looked at the world so that he gave her sons to whoever would give up his eternal life. You see some common words in there. Doesn't really make much sense. Maybe somebody was trying to fix something, but it evolved. Maybe you have this third example. God so loved the world, instead of loved, so that he gave his son to perish whoever would have eternal life. Can you see where I'm going with this? And then finally, what we have in front of us today is God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. But you can't trust that, because this is probably what happened. That's the impression that I can imagine somebody coming away from his talk with. That is not even close to the case. So last time we looked at an example. I gave you an example from one of the readings that we had in church. For the two readings from the New Testament that we had in church last time, I could find one variant, one place where there was a significant difference between manuscripts. And here's what it was. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, "Here's a good seat for you," but say to the poor man, "You stand there or sit on the floor by my feet," have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? So if you're reading a Greek New Testament, they come with what's called a critical apparatus, basically footnotes that will identify spots where different manuscripts say different things, and we can't say with 100% certainty what the original was. You get something like an asterisk here, and then the different variants are listed underneath. So these huge differences last time vary from "you stand there or sit on the floor by my feet." There are some that have "and" instead of "or." There are some that shorten it up a bit. I read them last time. You can see these are the big ones. These are the ones that are big enough to mention in a copy of the Greek New Testament, that the editor is saying, we think that you should know about this, we're that uncertain about it. Should we be concerned that meaning is being twisted?
To me, it's kind of like when your child is trying to read, punctuation means nothing to them. All of a sudden you get this huge run-on sentence, and it's like, wait, what? And you go back and you look at what they're doing, and it's like, okay, that's a question mark. Let's not forget that. To me, it seems like it's all a punctuation situation.
Yeah, and when the earliest copies of the New Testament didn't even have punctuation. That's a whole other issue. Even so, even with all of these differences, these critical apparatuses will show which manuscripts have what. And for example, this last one occurs in a translation of the New Testament in Coptic from, which is like an Egyptian translation of Egyptian kind of Greek thing, from the 8th or 9th or 10th century. So the one copy. So we can be relatively sure that's not it. We can be relatively sure that the one that's included in there is it. But in any case, it's not at all changing any meaning. This is a big one. I was gonna make a different one for today and just draw one from today's readings. There weren't any. Okay, so there was nothing significant enough to be put into a textual, a critical apparatus. So I want to spend a few minutes now just showing you more objectively than he showed us last time how the manuscripts of the New Testament spread. Okay, so we're doing this on a theoretical level right now, just as an example. An autograph is what you would call the original. So let's pretend that this is the Gospel of John. John writes the Gospel of John, and there aren't any copy machines or any of that stuff, not even Snapchat. So if you're going to if you want another copy of the Gospel of John, you're going to have to write it out by hand. And if you tried to copy the Gospel of John tonight or over the course of the next week, do you think that some errors might creep in?
And they didn't have erasers, and they were using the pocket. And if you made a mistake, just kept going.
Or crossed it out, or wrote something in the margin. We have every reason to think that they put great care into this. But I notice this when my kids read, when they read out loud, that sometimes they'll go from one line and skip one, go to the next line, and things like that. So let's say that three different people had access to the autograph and made 3 different copies. The chances of these 3 copies all being exactly the same are probably pretty low. But if you had all 3 of those copies and you could compare them against one another, and say C has a different reading that is the same in both A and B, it'd be easy to tell, okay, the guy that wrote C made a mistake. This is how textual criticism works. You look at the number of available manuscripts, you look at all of them that have that, and then you do that kind of comparing, and it's relatively easy to see, well, this is the one that made a mistake, and then it was perpetuated in the manuscripts that were produced after that. So then you have A, B, and C. Maybe they go off to different parts of the world, and then somebody makes a copy of A, maybe a bunch of people do, and then if there's a mistake, a different error put into A1, then those will perpetuate as they go on. And we don't, when we find a manuscript, we can't trace back the exact path that it took from there to there. To illustrate how easy it is to get to the bottom of these things, there's a New Testament professor at Dallas Theological Seminary who wrote a grammar that we would use in school, and he does an exercise with his students. He gives a number of students a copy of just some little story, and he says, he gives it 3 people. He's like, now I want you to corrupt the text. I want you to make changes that you hope that other people won't notice. I don't know if he does 3 or more. But so these students, they each corrupt it on their own, and then they all come together and they evaluate those 3 or 5 or whatever. And he says every single time he's done it, they've all been able to come back to the original because you're working with more than 2. So you're able to do that detective work based on the evidence and find out where the mistake was made. Sometimes it's not so simple as that, and you look at internal evidence instead and kind of think of, well, what might somebody have wanted to do to change this? Is there something that they might have written down the same word twice or something like that? It's actually kind of a fun thing if you're a nerd. Okay, so let's look at A, B, and C. Let's look at a different aspect of it. Okay, I got a map here. Here I got Mediterranean Sea. There's Europe. Here's Turkey over here. Egypt, Palestine, North Africa over there. Where were the books of the New Testament written?
Why don't you tell us?
Different places, right? Different places. bunch of them were written from Rome, a bunch of Paul's. Paul wrote other ones from Greece. One would assume that that the Gospels that may have been written in Palestine. So they're written all over the place. And then very early on, they are copied and then taken to other parts of the world. So when we go looking for manuscripts, and a lot of them have been found, we'll talk about that in a few minutes, that geographical separation, that kind of acts like putting something into a vault. Because if you have these things spread by hundreds of miles, and transportation between those areas is not easy, and if they're being copied and then taken to a different area and then copied and copied and copied there, say 50 years after the original is written, and you have an agenda that you want to change the Bible, how are you going to do it? You can't. Because if you have influence, say, in Egypt, and you're writing in all these changes there, well, you can't get to all. There's no way you can get to all the ones that are in the different parts of the world. So there's no way that one person can have influence over this. It's like this beautiful individualism. There's no powerful bureaucracy in the middle that has control over all these things. The size of the circles is to show the relative number of manuscripts that come from each of those areas. When it comes to making decisions of which variant is, which reading is the correct one, the two things that we're taught to look for is how old a manuscript is and how widespread that reading is. Just because something is old, well, an error could have crept in rather early, and that helps if something's old. But if it's old and it has attestation all over the world, then you can be sure. Well, if it says the same thing, if this is old and then these other readings have the same thing over here, then that is very likely the original reading. So it makes this. It's more of a science than an art, and a person can be very objective about it. And just like that professor does with the exercise with his students, it's really not so hard. Let's look at an example of this. Okay, so we don't have any of the originals. Okay, we don't have John's Gospel. You have a question or comment?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, after Jesus' ascension, is that why he sent the disciples where he sent them? Is that why he said, you are going there, you are going there, you are going there? So his word, which was given to them directly, very pure, went there. I just answered that guy's question. You can stop making thousands of dollars. Right?
Yeah, well, Jesus said, this is what Jesus said at his ascension. He said, you will be my witnesses, collectively, he said this to them, in Jerusalem, in all Judea to the south, Samaria to the north, and to the ends of the earth. He didn't send them out in specific directions by person, but 40 days later, he brought people from all over the world into Jerusalem for Pentecost that took the word back home. And then through a combination of intentional mission journeys and persecution, that quickly spread out. At that point in time, no books of the Bible no books of the New Testament had been written yet, but there were Christians in all these places who would, in a few decades, be using all those books in all those different places.
So it's all the original. So it's all the exact same stuff. So we answered one of those questions that you put up at the beginning of the. How do you know it's the original?
We can determine. I want to give you some examples of how maybe there are examples of differences that might come in. So you have one man, you don't know what the original is, but say in Egypt, you find a manuscript that says God loved the world. Say in Palestine, you find one that says God so loves the world. North Africa, God so loved the worlds. And then, let's say in Italy, the Father so loved the world. If you have those, can you figure out what the original said?
That there's a lot of love.
for father, is that likely the original?
No.
No, because you have three other ones that say it. Is loved past tense or present tense more likely? Okay, past tense, because there's more to that, and you can see how that goes on. You can reconstruct it based on the evidence, and those are just made up variants. The variants really don't have that kind of, don't even make that much of a difference. Cynthia?
Wait, I'm so sorry, I'm getting confused. Are you saying that, like, this would have been coming from a written down manuscript or from the word, I mean, like, word of mouth from the disciples?
So we know that the Apostle John wrote the gospel.
Of John?
Yeah, but we don't have that. We don't have the paper that he wrote it on. But we have Gospels of John all over the world that, by way of example, would have those different things.
I mean, do we have that for all? Is that what you're saying? All the New, or most of the New Testament?
The same kind of copies all over the world. Oh yeah, yeah.
But not for the old. I know we have Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, but are you gonna?
For the old too. The Old Testament are just as old as the New Testament, and
So they
they're
would around the same time?
no. The earliest manuscripts of the Old Testament that we have are from about the time of Jesus. We're going to get into something I think that might help in just a little bit. Okay, we are going to compare now the evidence, the number of manuscripts for the New Testament compared to other historical ancient writings. Okay, so what we have here is Caesar's Gallic Wars, Plato, Thucydides, Tacitus, I don't even know how to pronounce that one, Suetonius. Homer is the oldest one. Homer is super old. The Iliad. Okay, this column is going to show us when they wrote the originals. Okay, so Caesar, 100 to 44 BC. Okay, let's go to the next column right away with the example of Caesar. The earliest copy that we have of Caesar's Gallic Wars is from 1,000 years after the original was written. Does that make sense? Okay. So the oldest existing copy of Caesar's Gallic Wars is 1,000 years younger than Caesar. The number of manuscripts that attest to it, 10. Okay? We base our history of Rome on that. Okay?
Like secular history. I mean,
Yeah. So what we're looking at is the relative strength of New Testament evidence compared to other ancient sources. Let's go down to Homer. Homer wrote the Iliad about 900 BC. The earliest copy of that, 400 BC. That's a 500-year time span between the original and the oldest copy. And there's 643 manuscripts of that. We're not going to go through all of them. I think you'll get the point. The New Testament was written from about 40 or 50 AD. Last book, probably 95 to 100 AD. Okay. The oldest copy we have is from 125 about. So the time span from the autograph to the oldest manuscript we have, 25 to 50 years. Compare that to what we have for other sources. Okay. Our New Testament manuscript evidence blows away evidence for any other ancient writing. But which one is attacked for being unreliable? You can't know what it says. It's been copied so many times. There is no reason for that. There's no reason for that at all. Now, number of manuscripts. 10, 7, 8, 24,000. That 24,000 number that includes quotations of the New Testament in writing. So if somebody were looking for, if somebody down the road were looking to assemble the New Testament, maybe they found my sermons online where it has I don't put them online like that anymore, but that has the passage written out there. That something like that would be evidence. If you're just talking though, manuscripts that were written as part of the Bible, it brings it down quite a bit. It brings it down to about 5,600. You're still leaps and bounds beyond any of those. In fact, all of those references, those citations that are in non-Bibles, where people are just quoting the Bible, there are enough in there, with the exception of like 10 verses, you can construct the whole New Testament. So you have copies of the Bible, you have other things that quote the Bible. Even if you didn't have any of the Bible things themselves, you would be able to reconstruct the whole thing just based on the things that quote the Bible from back then. So there's absolutely no question about the Bible's authenticity. And can you imagine making something up? How difficult it would be to make something up and then to spread it all over the world like that? It would be impossible. Maybe just real quick, how do we know how old things are? Or how do we know that this is like a really old manuscript? I won't bore you with all the details, but basically you tell from the type of letters that they use when they write it, the writing style, and the things on which they wrote them. Carbon dating is used a little bit, that just verifies. But just like if you looked at writing style today compared to 50 years ago, you'd probably see some difference. And now we just type it all out. This graph just shows the distribution. When we get to the very early centuries, there aren't nearly as many copies, which is to be expected. That things are going to get lost over time, especially when there's a lot of persecution. But these things still back up that what these things say are old, because there's portions of it in there. We already looked at this in a different format. The time gap to the earliest manuscript for other ancient histories, Herodotus is a historian, and we construct history based on his writings. There is about 1,500 years since the time he wrote it to the time that we have the oldest manuscript. When you get to the Gospel of John, then you're just talking just a few years. Okay. I want to address, and I'm going to do this very quickly so that we don't get stalled, that there are some bigger differences that you may notice between Bibles. When the King James Version, which is a very influential Bible version, was written, it was based on about 100 manuscripts. Okay, about 100 manuscripts. Now we have about 5,600. That gives us a much better idea of what the original is. We have a ton more evidence to go by. On account of, and still, you read your King James Version, you read your NIV, you're not really going to see many differences, but maybe a couple places you will. I want to point out one between the NIV and the King James Version. This is from 1 John chapter 5. So, in our Bibles, it says, "This is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ. He did not come by water only, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who testifies, because the Spirit is truth. For there are three that testify, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and the three are in agreement." These are the same verses that you can already see. It's a lot longer. I'm just going to pick up where it departs. "For there are three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one." that part isn't in the NIV. And you can see, well, that's a pretty significant passage. Because it says there are three that testify in heaven, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and these three are one. What important doctrine is that? There's laid out, right, black and white. There's the Trinity. Okay, and that's in the King James Version. The problem is that the earliest Greek manuscript that has that in it is from the 1600s. It's from the 1500s, I should say. And before that, the Greek is just a translation of the Latin that somebody added. There is no doubt that is not part of the original. And it's likely that someone along the line maybe wrote that into a margin and it found its way in, or think that they maybe needed to defend the Trinity a little bit more. It's a fine verse, and it teaches in line with the truth, but it just doesn't belong in there. It's just, we can know it's not part of the original. Someone might accuse us, well, you're taking stuff out of the Bible, you must be denying the Trinity, and that's not it at all. It's simply that that's obviously not part of the original. And even the evidence, the objective evidence aside, you could ask questions like, well, if that's always been in there, then why weren't people quoting it when they were debating the Trinity in the early church? Nobody ever seems to have mentioned that one. It came in later. So there are some bigger things, but even then, they don't affect doctrine at all, and they are crystal clear that they don't belong. There are two longer passages that are debated that I think that can go either way. These will probably show in your English translation of the Bible. One is John chapter 8. Remember when they were about to stone that sinful woman, and Jesus is there, and he draws the line in the sand, and he says, like, he who is without sin cast the first stone. Whether that is part of the original, there's question marks about that. And people who hold to the inspiration of the Bible come down on both sides based on the evidence. And then also the last verses of the Gospel of Mark. But even then, it does not change. It does not change teaching at all. All right, I lectured a lot today. Hopefully some of this but Claire needs to practice, so I can't go over today. Okay, for next time. I would like to keep moving, but I want to address this together with you, and then again talk about framing a response, using this as an opportunity to tell people why this is so important to us. Okay, but think about this question. If God were so concerned about us having his word without error, then why not preserve the original? Okay? So you can think about that. Why didn't God create a book, put it in a safe that had the original? Let's pray. Father in heaven, we ask that you would keep us steadfast in your word against all attacks against it. It's by your Spirit that you convince us that your word is truth. But we thank you also for preserving so many copies of it in a way that they were distributed around the world, that we really don't need to have any doubt at all that what we have is what the original authors of the Bible wrote. Help us to understand this so that we can explain it to others in a loving way, with the goal not of winning an argument, but of showing them that the Bible is worth listening to, so that through that word you might go to work. Amen.